Thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to be here, and this panel is fantastic so far. Both presentations were really good. So I'm going to present a paper that has been already published. So whatever thoughts and comments you have cannot be taken into account, but they will be really useful for our follow-up projects. You know Georgios. So I will be talking about, I think there are definitely clear links between what I will talk about and the previous two presentations. So I will be talking about empathy, citizens' empathy towards refugees, and how this can be harnessed, so to speak, to moderate intergroup tensions. Right, our research is motivated by a very urgent empirical problem. So how can we reduce public hostility towards refugees in contexts where migration securitization is sustained? Of course, last year in the summer of 2024, the UK experienced a wave of anti-immigration protests, riots across multiple cities. These have been revived this week in Northern Ireland, in Ballymena. Now, these are not isolated incidents, but they are symptoms of a deep dynamic we observe in security studies, this vicious circle of security and insecurity, where governments, in order to respond to public anxiety, they introduce restrictive immigration policies. But instead of alleviating fears, these measures often reinforce a sense of threat, fueling further resentment. And this cycle creates a fertile ground for misinformation and disinformation. So this is something, of course, that helped ignite the 2024 riots. Now, while securitization theory has offered powerful tools for understanding how security narratives take hold, much less is known about how to reverse securitization processes. And this is where our study comes in. So empathy, I have included a quote by Barack Obama, empathy is often celebrated in liberal democracies as the key to peaceful coexistence, right? So we decided to explore the value of empathy as a potential pathway for successful migration securitization. A supporter of the National Front, sharing joyfully a vegan sausage roll with the Middle Eastern refugees. Now, this is a tall order for peaceful coexistence. Now, this level of peaceful coexistence feels almost utopian. However, much academic research, often based on self-report measures of empathy, tends to present empathy as a silver bullet for intergroup conflict. So self-reported empathy typically involves an in-group member taking a presumed perspective of an out-group member. So this approach introduces well-known biases, including socially desirable responding and gendered framing. And while we do see real potential in empathy as a tool for the desecuritization of migration, we argue that its role must be understood in a more nuanced way and in more measured terms. And to do that, we decided to create a new construct that doesn't rely on self-report. So how can we trust the version of the world we imagine through another's eyes if we haven't asked them how they actually see the world? To make a twist to what Barack Obama talked about regarding empathy earlier in the quote. So our approach is relational and context-specific. We define intersubjective empathy, which is the novel construct that we introduced, as the ability of in-group members to accurately recognize the emotions of out-group members given their actual experiences. We understand desecuritization as a two-stage process where that requires not only a reduction in perceived threats, so this is the threat identification stage, how threatening immigrants are to a country's national security, for example, but also a sense of obligation to act, so the threat of mobilization stage. So in other words, rejecting the idea of immigrants as a threat is necessary but insufficient. Sustainable change, in our opinion, depends on whether publics feel compelled to support those they no longer see as dangerous. So essentially, we treat intersubjective empathy as a potential psychological pathway to an audience-based desecuritization. Now, to empirically assess our new construct, intersubjective empathy, we designed two parallel surveys, one with 1,500 British citizens we conducted in October 2017, and one with about 500 young Syrian refugees, which was carried out between July and September 2017. Our construct requires that an in-group's presumed perspective of an out-group's emotions is always triangulated with the actual emotional state reported by the out-group itself. So we calculated an intersubjective empathy score for each citizen based on how closely their selected emotions matched the actual distribution of responses given by the refugees. So this resulted in a continuous variable where higher scores indicate greater emotional accuracy. And as you can see, of course, British citizens were really bad at empathizing, accurately recognizing refugees' emotions in this particular case. Now, this weighted approach allows us to account for how representative each emotion is within the refugee sample, making it a precise and context-sensitive measure. So importantly, the way we understand empathy is very different from the way Barack Obama understands empathy, right? So empathy, according to Obama, was a personality trait. We understand empathy as a cognitive ability, right? So the ability to recognize the emotions actually experienced by the other side. Why do we need this relational and context-specific approach? Well, we need it because there is a large empathy gap between citizens and refugees. I don't think you can read these graphs, so let me just guide you through it. So refugees most commonly reported positive emotions for their life in the UK. So they talked about how happy, how hopeful they are, how happy they are, how grateful they are, and how confident they are. This was in 2017 UK, right? So soon after the Brexit referendum. Now, in contrast to the refugees, only one of these emotions was actually recognized by citizens who assumed that refugees instead predominantly felt anxious, hopeful, which was the only positive emotion recognized, afraid and desperate. Now, this big mismatch between how refugees felt and how British citizens thought refugees felt demonstrates the need for a construct like our construct, so a relational and context-specific construct. And we also found that higher scores of intersubjective empathy are significantly associated with pro-social attitudes and emotional dispositions, so things that you would expect from an empathy measure, right? So we found that intersubjective empathy is correlated with greater levels of interpersonal trust, with a stronger belief in egalitarian values, with a track record of volunteerism, and with increased pro-social emotions towards refugees overall, right? So feeling hopeful towards refugees, feeling proud for them, feeling happy for them. So importantly, these associations reinforce the validity of our construct as a multidimensional measure of out-group-oriented empathy and pro-sociality in this case. But is it actually correlated with reduced threat perceptions, immigration threat perceptions? So we constructed a composite 1 to 5 scale variable of public attitudes based on citizens' agreement or disagreement with statements linked to all 4 dimensions of the migration security nexus. So immigrants as a threat to the economy, to culture, to criminality, and to national security. So the immigrants increase criminality rates, immigrants are potential terrorist threats. So the mean score was calculated so that a higher score indicates more positive attitudes towards refugees, and thus a reduced threat perception at the stage of identification. Now, we found that intersubjective empathy was consistently associated with reduced threat perception. And crucially, these results hold even when controlling for a wide range of explanatory variables. So In short, when people are better at recognizing how refugees actually feel, they are less likely to view them as a threat. But does it have an actionable component? We found that citizens with higher intersubjective empathy scores are significantly more likely to endorse the belief that everyone has a duty to help refugees. This was the dependent variable in a second regression analysis. So this sense of moral obligation reflects the mobilization stage of desecuritization. So citizens with higher levels of intersubjective empathy are not only more likely to recognize refugees as non-threatening, but they're also more likely to feel personally responsible for supporting them. However, our analysis also reveals a curvilinear relationship between intersubjective empathy and the sense of duty to help. Support increases with empathy, but only up to a point. So beyond that point, very high levels of intersubjective empathy are associated with slightly declining support of the idea of the obligation to care for refugees. Now, why this might be? Usually, the literature talks about the backfiring effect in empathy, but it tends to link that backfiring effect with emotional fatigue or disengagement, right? So that you cannot so you're able to fully recognize how the other side feels, and you become overwhelmed. You feel like a burden by this ability. But bear in mind that I just talked about refugees feeling positive emotions, mostly. So what is happening in this particular case? So we propose a different interpretation beyond emotional fatigue or disengagement, which is grounded in our empirical findings. So in our case, refugees expressed positive emotions: hope, happiness, gratitude about their lives in the UK. Now, citizens with very high levels of intersubjective empathy were, of course, better at recognizing these emotions, and as a result, they may have concluded that refugees are doing well, so they don't really need our support, right? But alternatively, rather than assuming help isn't needed, highly empathetic citizens may have perceived refugee well-being as actually coming at their own expense. So these emotions of happiness, gratefulness, etc., were achieved among refugees at the cost of citizens' access to resources, opportunities, and social cohesion. And this brings us to the concept of perceived self-threat, perhaps the most plausible explanation for the backfiring effect in this particular case. So in zero-sum or negatively interdependent contexts where we have an institutionalized where migration has been institutionally, structurally securitized, permanently securitized, even accurate perspective taking, such as intersubjective empathy, may be associated with in-group defensiveness. So we try in our paper to make conceptual, empirical, and practical contribution to understanding how empathy may actually be used to moderate intergroup tensions. So conceptually, we propose a novel measure of out-group empathy, intersubjective empathy, which is grounded in the emotional realities of out-groups themselves. We triangulate what the in-group thinks the out-group feels with what the out-group actually reports feeling. And we move beyond self-report metrics towards a more rigorous and more politically relevant understanding of empathy. Now, empirically, we show that empathy, while promising, is not a panacea. So it can be fostered and harnessed to support desecuritization, but only under certain conditions, particularly when it is not overshadowed by institutionalized threat narratives, zero-sum framings of societal resources. So practically, this has implications for both policy making and refugee advocacy, right? So it's very important to foreground refugee voices and agencies, so to move beyond the suffering, the victimhood frame. And it's also really, really important to promote forms of empathy that are anchored in real experience, beyond assumptions, beyond projections. So we do not claim that empathy will reverse securitization alone, right? But we argue that when it is conceptualized intersubjectively and measured carefully, it offers a promising route towards a more sustainable desecuritization of migration. So thank you very much.